All right, here we are again. Welcome. Thanks for watching. And it's the best mastermind group. That's the name we came up for ourselves recently. It's our second hot seat recording, and we are going to be talking about our good friend and colleague, Jeff Nichols. Really excited to hear from the group about experiences and insights on him. And I think we're going to start off with Lee to kind of intro Jeff and some personal experiences working with him.
Well, hello, everybody, and hi, Jeff.
Hi, Lee.
The first thing I'd like you to do is, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are?
About who I am. Well,
yes, the famous question. Who are you in this world?
I am somebody who is trying to get better the older I get. And if I can, positively impact people around me to help them to get better. It sounds kind of cliche, but I've learned a lot of lessons making mistakes, and I've learned to make less mistakes along the way. And so my profession, my job in the real world, I'm in sales and business development for a biomedical company. And I'm also going to be launching a history podcast very soon. So I think that pretty much would wrap up who I am. Trying to get better, building business both for a company I work for as well as for myself.
All right. Well, that's a pretty good answer. So, Jeff, when you and I first met, it was really interesting because I was actually quite taken aback because we actually spent, 3 hours talking. And what really amazed me about you, Jeff, it was. And what really amazed me and what I would recommend anybody that decides to work with Jeff or listen to his podcast or however you encounter Jeff in this world is to know that he is a warm personality. He's very inquisitive. For me, he really helped me gain some clarity around my business because I was shifting gears on my business. So as we talked and learned more about each other, he helped me get a bit more clear on that. So that was helpful. And what really amazed me, though, is I don't like history. I don't read history. I watch historical dramas sometimes, but I've never been a history person. Jeff has now intrigued me. And it's kind of like, I want to know more about this history that you're talking about. So why don't you tell us about what your podcast is going to be like and why it's different from what we would normally learn in school or even hear on the news?
That's a great question. The podcast is going to be focused on American history, although I like all history, but it's really based on critical thinking skills. So, I always break it down. There's things like trivia, which if you think about that, I know a lot of people like trivia, but to be trivial is to be minimal and minimalized. And I think a lot of times we'll take topics we think we understand and we really only minimalize those. So, we're very trivia oriented when it comes to history. And so oftentimes names, places, dates that we've heard, we believe because we've heard the name, date, or place so often, we believe we have an air of familiarity that we don't have. And so the podcast really is meant to open that up and just kind of demonstrate that we can learn a lot from history. And when we learn from history, then we actually can make better decisions, political, social, personal decisions. When an issue comes up in life, my goal is to have as many index cards in the back of my head as possible to kind of pull from and say, I've heard of a scenario like that before, and this is what they did, and this is how it ended up. So the podcast really it's on history, but it's about making better decisions. And at the end of the day, that's the hope, is that, we come away from that living better lives.
Oh, that's great. That's really powerful, especially with what we're dealing with now. So have you had anybody that's kind of asked your perception of how the COVID virus is affecting the world and what the historical ramifications of this are, as far as, has this happened in history before? Is anything like this?
Yeah, it's funny. I'll say two things on that. About a month ago, 2 months ago maybe, I watched a YouTube interview with Dan Carlin, who is, I think he's got the biggest history podcast in the world right now, as far as listeners. And he used to do a segment called Common Sense, where he talked about a lot of contemporary things. And it was interesting in the interview. He said that he tends to stay away from the contemporary. I'm kind of paraphrasing. He'll probably get a hold of this and want to clobber me. But he basically said the contemporary isn't as much fun to talk about anymore. So one of the things that concerns me is that we are so divided. And it's been a long time coming, starting maybe in the early 90s. I wouldn't say it was Bill Clinton's fault, but it just kind of coincides early 90s, about the time Clinton became president, where we've had these successive convulsions in our society. Whether it was Randy Weaver, David Koresh, the USS Cole, Timothy McVeigh, Columbine, all of these things, when we look at it successively, have happened over a short period of time. And each one of these events has really changed society. The 24-hour news cycle has changed society. We didn't recover from 2001 or 2008. So I think we really have changed, and this is going to impact us significantly. But I don't know that anyone can really say what that looks like yet. I mean, this is not the same culture as we had 20 years ago. And it's really breathtaking when you think of it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you.
Hey,
Yeah.
Jeff, when you were talking about the critical thinking skills, looking at history through critical thinking skills, and what made me think of it is that whole phrase, those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. And it sounds like what you're trying to do is short circuit that problem and make it so that we don't repeat, the failures of the past. Is that pretty accurate way to kind of think about it? And second, what made you want to communicate this kind of thing to other people? Like, why make that connection?
Yeah, I do think so. So I think if we go back, first of all, to the concept of trivia, we do think most of the things that we do in life are just mere mechanics. I always use the example in my own head of learning to walk. So a baby learns to walk, and they have to have coordination and muscles and a desire to stand upright and move forward. And there's this mechanical process. But after the mechanics are mastered, then there's this utilitarian part of that, where it's not about walking so much as being mobile and moving places and doing things you couldn't do before. And especially with history, it's a perfect example. We are very mechanical. We remember names, dates, places in chronological order, and we believe that that's knowing history. And this is why we make a lot of mistakes. But to really know those facts and then have this utilitarian side of it, like how do we apply that? I think it helps a lot in making decisions. And I can say for myself, I was not a very good student in school behaviorally, and got in a lot of trouble when I was younger. But I always liked history, and I always did well at that. I got good grades, and I think one of the reasons why was I found it fun to apply those lessons, and I attribute that a lot to me kind of, as I grew into adulthood, leaving some of those things behind as I've applied history when I learned it. And so if I can pass that kind of a thought process on to other people, the hope would be that they would make better decisions, maybe commit less mistakes than I did as they, move through their life. So I found it to be a great tool to make decisions for myself.
Yeah, great answer. Excellent, Jeff. Speaking of that, and I'm not sure who wants to go next with some more comments or questions for Jeff. I'll jump in with just something on to riff off what Doug said. But if you could talk a little bit about the formats and who right now you're wanting to get in touch with, reach out to with this particular format, and starting off with some videos that you did, but with the longer form podcast, who's a good was a good connection for you, and how do you see that serving different groups, organizations, individuals? Could you talk a little bit about that, who you're focused on right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's two main groups. The first one is kind of the backyard barbecue people that aren't, trained in history, don't have a political science major or something like that. It's just a fun thing for people to talk about. But then the other group that we're focusing on really is, education, educators, academic groups, whether it's, homeschool groups or public education. I'd love to do, anything from putting these videos together and maybe marketing that, getting together with administrators, helping them figure out what curriculum to look at or where the focus really ought to be. So many of our historical figures, again, we've so bottlenecked exactly who and what they are that we haven't learned from them. And so just kind of pointing that out, the podcast, as I've been putting together, moving forward, putting together some of the final touches on these first few episodes is really just kind of like the layers of an onion, peeling that back and looking at some of these people as real people and human beings and realizing they made mistakes along the way. And before some of these guys rose to greatness, there were a lot of mistakes and a lot of failures. And, what was it that contributed to the personality that we see today? And, helping people in the educational field to make those curriculum decisions so that the kids come away, as Lee said, she doesn't like history or hasn't liked it. Kids come away excited about it, and they want to learn more, and they want to, when they pick up a book, they want to be able to think about that person as a human being and what they really went through and put yourself in their position and being able to pass that enthusiasm on to educators.
And empathy too, maybe. A little bit of empathy goes a long way. A little bit of historical empathy.
What we find is everybody's hero was a villain at one time, and everybody's villain can be a hero too. Criminals love their children, and their children love them. So it's great to study history, and like you say, have empathy for that.
Right.
So that would be.
No, that's a great answer. Paul, did you want to jump in next?
Absolutely. I've had the pleasure to work with Jeff both in the medical and also with the history. And one of the things that I like about your title is about history coming alive. And I just think I kind of want to ask a question. What the difference between when you're teaching in, say, normal schools where they homogenize it, how do we get to that place of being homogenized, and how do we get away from that to actually tell the truth about history and talk about the interesting facts that these are really people? Going forward in education, what would you like to see changed?
That's a great question. Personally, I'd love to move away from a chronological, this need to follow a chronological approach.
Mm-hmm.
We certainly have to use time and chronology to figure out where we're at. But I think one of the approaches really ought to be focusing more, at topical or subjects, so that we can allow the students, and I think the educators would have fun too, but allow the students to really, again, see these people in history as they really were, without getting too far down rabbit trails. One of my favorite things, and Nathan's going to roll his eyes, but, some of our most influential founding fathers of the country, back in their day weren't really recognized as that important. And it's only over the course of time, because of certain, stories that are told about them, and certain myths that have grown up around their personalities, that they've become these leading figures. And so being able to follow the rabbit trails and more, I would love to see more biographies. And, instead of studying, we've got to study, the Revolutionary War this year. Let's take the decades leading up to it and the decades after it, and a few main characters, and really follow their biography. I think it gives a much more insightful presentation of history and of the people. And again, that allows you then to really look at all of the pieces and to be able to make really good decisions, knowing that they had these failures and these successes, and how did they recover from those things? Only hearing about George Washington winning the revolution doesn't tell us anything about the man George Washington.
Right. Right. That's a great point. Yeah, and you know, the stories, you know, the ones that I would roll my eyes at, only because we've had that conversation so many times. These interesting stories, you know, Paul Revere's, one of my favorite that you brought up to me a few months ago. You know, Paul Revere's most famous ride wasn't the one that he gets credit for instance.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Like that. Washington's first campaign wasn't exactly a success, and all these different angles on these people that we think we know. We know them because we got the timeline version of them when it was a quick, you know, rest stop on the way, and then, you know, didn't actually camp out and get to know these characters. So
yeah, to the history, or to the victor go the spoils, right? So
right.
If you've won the day, you frame the argument, and the rest of those things are lost to history.
Right. John, what do you got for Jeff?
Oh, where do I
perspective?
begin?
Where do you want to start? I'm sure you were taking some notes too.
Jeff is a man after my own heart. I really like what he has done, and I caught what he said about historical familiarity. So I've been kind of on my, on my heels, reeling at all this stuff I've heard recently. A lot of it, what Nathan just said, Paul Revere, that's a great example. But a lot of this has gotten me to question. Jeff's approach is more interactive than, say, a narrator, somebody just reading an event as we understood it, and not just tackling a subject like a lot of people have in the past with starry-eyed American exceptionalism, but actually questioning the person of who they were, and maybe not a deity, but a man. Full of flaws and personal motivations, and some good and maybe some not so good, and it's just really interesting. So I've had to question the way I look at history, and which is great because we need to really question everything we believe and my belief system and so on and so forth. So for me, history has always been the lens in which I view life through. So studying history, every time I read a new era, a new place, and a new person, I'm able to stick a lens then. So it's a new filter in which I can view current circumstances and people and leaders and stuff like that through the context of, oh, I've seen them before in history, or this event is not so different than that event of 100 years ago. And so for me, I love history, and I really like what Jeff is doing. I really appreciate it. And he's bringing to the world what like a maester was doing, in Game of Thrones. Like it's not, it is a knowledge.
I knew we'd get a great reference out of you.
Yeah.
The Game of Thrones reference.
That, nerds, because I knew that struck home with some of you. But he is bringing something that is needed. That is an art. That is something that needs to be challenged and honed and tended and built, because it's just so very important. Because who are we without our history and our books and passed on throughout generations for better understanding. And it's not just information, because like Jeff was saying, everything has changed and it's gotten more aggressive by degrees. That I think with a lot of like the growth of the internet and then just not being able to differentiate between just information and, say, wisdom, knowledge and wisdom. And then Jeff sort of surgically gets into all that and shows like the difference between the three, which a lot of people I would say don't know the difference between just our never-ending supplies of information and then what Jeff brings to the table, which is some thoughtful understanding, humility, and willingness to explore alongside of the student tuning in and listening to him. So I find this really good. I'm a big fan of Dan Carlin and hardcore history. I was actually just listening to the third installment of Armageddon 3. I've listened to all of his stuff, so I really like what Jeff brings, and I'm eager to hear more of it, and I'm gonna definitely add it to my collection of stuff I just gobble up all the time.
Awesome.
we're all real excited about the launch, Jeff, and the initial success, the videos, great response, the intro videos. So there's a series right now. It's on YouTube, Facebook, launching Instagram soon, and dabbling with LinkedIn. Right. So those are the kind of your full sweep on the history.
Yes.
So and I love the name you came up with. What's it called again?
Tell us.
This is your plug, Jeff.
History comes alive.
History comes alive and the best part, with Jeff Nichols.
Yes.
So we're real excited for the launch. It's been great to be a part of it. Great to get the word out, and we're just real excited to see your success. So we've got your back, and if anyone is interested in hearing more about what Jeff is doing, you can reach out really to anyone in the group here that you're connected with if you want to talk to them. So thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone, for your input and sharing, and talk to you again real soon.
Take care, guys. See you next week.
Bye.
All right. Bye.